Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on February 18th, 2026, the Trump administration issued a directive ordering the Federal Emergency Management Agency to suspend the deployment of over 300 disaster relief workers to areas recovering from natural disasters across the United States? Despite having $7 billion in available funding specifically designated for disaster response that remains completely unaffected by the ongoing government shutdown. And what if I told you that this deliberate restriction of emergency services to American communities represents not a budgetary necessity, but a calculated attempt to weaponize human suffering as political leverage in congressional negotiations over immigration enforcement? The suspension order came through an internal email from Kurt Wierick, FEMA's chief of staff, stating that the Department of Homeland Security had issued a stop travel order for all DHS-funded travel, effective February 18, 2026, for the duration of the lapse in appropriation, and specifically noting that this does include disaster travel. This directive immediately halted deployment of disaster response personnel who were preparing for assignments across 17 active disaster declarations, including communities still recovering from devastating winter storms and the recent Oklahoma wildfires that prompted Governor Kevin Stitt to declare a state of emergency. The timing and scope of this restriction reveal the administration's willingness to sacrifice essential government services for partisan political theater. The Department of Homeland Security entered a partial shutdown on Saturday, February 15th, after congressional Democrats demanded reforms to immigration enforcement practices following the deaths of 2 American protesters killed by federal immigration officers in Minneapolis. Rather than negotiate in good faith or allow essential disaster response operations to continue unimpeded, the Trump administration chose to create artificial consequences that would harm disaster victims in order to pressure Democratic lawmakers. The cynical nature of this decision becomes clear when examining FEMA's funding structure. The agency operates using 2 distinct funding streams: appropriated funds for day-to-day operations and the Disaster Relief Fund, which contains over $7 billion specifically allocated by Congress for emergency response activities. The DRF operates as no-year money, meaning it remains available for disaster response regardless of government shutdowns or appropriations lapses. Multiple FEMA sources confirmed that funding for disaster deployments was readily available and that the travel restrictions were imposed solely for political purposes. Michael Cohen, who served as FEMA chief of staff under both the Obama and Biden administrations, characterized the deployment suspension as evidence of amateur hour at DHS, noting that the administration was desperate to show consequences of the shutdown, despite the fact that disaster relief funding was completely unaffected by the appropriations lapse. Cohen emphasized that government shutdowns traditionally do not impede ongoing disaster recovery efforts, because disaster response is considered essential government function with dedicated funding streams, specifically designed to operate independently of political disputes. The 300 FEMA personnel ordered to stand down from their disaster assignments represent critical expertise in emergency management, damage assessment, and community recovery coordination. Many of these workers were already at training facilities preparing for specific deployments when they received orders to suspend their missions. This disruption not only delays assistance to communities in immediate need, but also breaks the continuity of ongoing recovery efforts where federal coordination is essential for effective state and local response. The administration's justification for the suspension relies on a deliberately misleading interpretation of shutdown requirements. DHS defended the travel restrictions by claiming they were not a choice, but necessary to comply with federal law, while simultaneously acknowledging that FEMA travel related to active disasters is not canceled. This contradiction exposes the artificial nature of the restrictions and confirms that the administration is selectively applying shutdown procedures to maximize political pressure, rather than following established protocols for essential government functions. The human cost of this political calculation becomes evident when examining the 17 active disaster declarations currently affecting American communities. The most recent declarations stem from Oklahoma wildfires that have destroyed homes and threatened lives across multiple counties. Other active disasters include winter storms that caused widespread power outages, property damage, and displacement across multiple states. These communities depend on federal expertise and resources to coordinate effective recovery efforts, and the arbitrary suspension of FEMA deployments delays critical assistance during the most vulnerable period of disaster recovery. The Potomac River sewage crisis provides perhaps the most glaring example of the administration's willingness to subordinate emergency response to political theater. On Monday, February 17th, President Trump announced that FEMA would play a key role in responding to the massive sewage spill that released over 240 million gallons of untreated wastewater into the Potomac River following a sewer line collapse in Montgomery County, Maryland. Trump specifically criticized Maryland Governor Wes Moore and other Democratic officials while promising federal intervention to address what he characterized as one of the largest sewage spills in American history. Less than 24 hours after making this public commitment to federal disaster response, the Trump administration issued the travel restrictions that prevented FEMA from deploying the promised resources. According to 3 agency officials, FEMA has deployed few, if any, resources to assist with the sewage spill, despite the president's public commitments and the immediate threat to public health in the Washington metropolitan area. This reversal demonstrates that the administration views disaster response not as a federal obligation to protect public health and safety, but as a political commodity to be withheld or granted based on partisan considerations. The deployment suspension represents the latest escalation in a pattern of political interference with FEMA operations that began immediately after Trump took office in January 2025. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem implemented a policy requiring her personal approval for any FEMA spending over $100,000, creating a massive backlog of disaster and emergency preparedness funding that has caused widespread frustration among members of Congress and state officials. This micromanagement approach has consistently delayed critical disaster response activities and demonstrates the administration's priority of political control over emergency management effectiveness. The broader implications of weaponizing disaster response extend beyond immediate harm to specific communities into questions about the fundamental role of government during emergencies. FEMA was established precisely because natural disasters do not respect political boundaries, and because effective emergency response requires federal coordination and resources that transcend local and state capabilities. When disaster response becomes contingent on political negotiations rather than human need, the basic social contract between government and citizens breaks down. Former FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell, who served under President Biden, explained that the deployment restrictions would particularly impact the agency's ability to process disaster claims and provide reimbursements to state and local governments. These communities often must front the costs of immediate disaster response with the understanding that federal reimbursement will follow. When FEMA operations are disrupted for political reasons, communities bear additional financial burdens during their most vulnerable periods, while recovery efforts lose the coordination and expertise that federal involvement provides. The artificial nature of these restrictions becomes even more apparent when considering that the Trump administration simultaneously maintains that DHS continues to operate normally because most of its functions are deemed essential. Immigration and Customs Enforcement continues its operations with over $70 billion in funding secured through previous congressional action. Customs and Border Protection maintains full operations at ports of entry and along the border. The Transportation Security Administration continues airport security screening. Only disaster response, specifically, has been targeted for suspension despite having dedicated funding that remains completely available. The deployment suspension also reveals the administration's misunderstanding of FEMA's mission and operational requirements. Effective disaster response depends on rapid deployment of federal expertise and resources during the critical period immediately following a disaster. Delays measured in days or weeks can mean the difference between successful community recovery and long-term economic devastation. When political considerations delay or prevent federal response, communities lose not only immediate assistance, but also the coordination necessary for effective long-term recovery planning. Congressional Democrats have characterized the deployment restrictions as evidence of the administration's willingness to hold disaster victims hostage to political negotiations. Democratic legislators note that the administration created this crisis by refusing to negotiate immigration enforcement reforms that would prevent the kind of civilian casualties that prompted the current standoff. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer described the travel suspension as part of a broader pattern of rogue behavior by federal agencies that prioritizes partisan politics over public service, the international implications of politicizing disaster response damage, America's credibility as a global leader in emergency management. FEMA has historically provided technical assistance and expertise to international disaster response efforts, sharing best practices developed through decades of experience managing natural disasters across diverse geographic and climatic conditions. When the United States demonstrates that its own disaster response is subject to political manipulation rather than professional standards, it undermines the credibility of American emergency management expertise globally. The deployment suspension occurs at a time when climate change is increasing both the frequency and severity of natural disasters affecting American communities. The National Weather Service has issued warnings about an active winter storm season that could produce additional disasters, requiring federal coordination and response. Wildfire season approaches with drought conditions already evident across western states. The arbitrary restriction of disaster response capability during a period of heightened natural disaster risk demonstrates the administration's willingness to compromise public safety for political advantage. Friends, what we are witnessing in the Fema deployment suspension is not sound fiscal management or necessary compliance with shutdown procedures, but the deliberate weaponization of human suffering for political leverage. The Trump administration has chosen to create artificial consequences for disaster victims in order to pressure congressional Democrats into accepting immigration enforcement policies without the reforms necessary to prevent civilian casualties. The $7 billion sitting unused in the Disaster Relief Fund, while 300 FEMA workers are ordered to stand down from disaster assignments, represents a fundamental betrayal of the federal government's obligation to protect American communities during emergencies. The administration's claim that these restrictions are required by law is contradicted by their own acknowledgement that essential disaster response can continue, and by decades of precedent showing that disaster relief operations continue during government shutdowns. The human cost of this political calculation will be measured in delayed recovery times for disaster-affected communities, increased financial burdens on state and local governments, and the erosion of public trust in federal emergency management capabilities. When disaster victims become bargaining chips in political negotiations, the basic function of government to protect its citizens during emergencies has been corrupted beyond recognition. The ultimate question facing Congress and the American people is whether disaster response will remain an essential government function based on human need and professional standards, or whether it will be transformed into a political weapon subject to partisan manipulation. The answer to this question will determine not only the effectiveness of America's emergency management system, but the fundamental relationship between government and citizens during their most vulnerable moments.